So tonight, let's welcome Edward Fishman. In his new book, Chokepoints, Fishman takes us deep into the back rooms of power to reveal the untold history of the last 2 decades of U.S. foreign policy, in which America renounced the gospel of globalization and waged a new kind of economic war. Chokepoints was named today the Wall Street Journal's one of 10 best books of February. Pretty cool, give it up. All right, so today, Fishman will be talking about his book Chokepoints, and he teaches at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And today he'll be in conversation with Elizabeth Ralph, who is the editor of Politico magazine. So please give them a warm welcome, Edward Fishman and Elizabeth Ralph.
Hello, hi everybody. It's lovely to be here with you all on this afternoon, and I'm thrilled to be here and also interviewing my friend Eddie, who I've known for many years. We went to college together. You have managed to write this truly fabulous and engrossing book on a topic that many people would say is not that conducive to sort of like gripping narrative. So congratulations.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you, Elizabeth.
We will have time for questions at the end, about 20 minutes. So think of your questions, and then we'll come back to you guys in a little bit. Eddie, you have firsthand experience crafting sanctions policy. You've obviously been writing about sanctions for some time, including for Politico, but for other outlets. What inspired you to tackle this subject in a much bigger way?
So it really comes back to my experience working in government. When I was in government, something that struck me was that we were using tools of economic warfare more than ever before. Sanctions, export controls, tariffs. They had become really the primary way that the United States was trying to advance its interests around the world. But the thing that was always confusing and honestly somewhat disconcerting to me is you'd go to meetings in the Situation Room to discuss what sanctions to put on Russia or what sanctions to put on Iran. And there would only ever be like 2 or 3 people who would be willing to say anything. And most people, even really, really smart people, would just like kind of go quiet as soon as the sanctions topic came up. And I think the reason is that sanctions just feel arcane. They feel like, inscrutable. Like what actually are they? We know that it's something that the U.S. does, but what do they mean? And so as a result, the 1 or 2 people in the room who actually knew what the subject at hand were just dominated the conversation. And you didn't actually have a fulsome debate. And the other thing I noticed, and this was something I had the privilege of seeing when I moved over to the policy planning staff and getting to go to backbench, deputies committees meetings and principal committees meetings where you have people like the Secretary of State in the room. The higher up you go, the lower the amount of knowledge there is on sanctions. And it was disconcerting because we're using these tools so much. And if you contrast that to the use of military force, everyone has an opinion on the use of military force. It's because it's accessible. People read popular histories of wars and people know battles, but no one feels that they know what sanctions really are. And so for that reason is really why I went to Columbia to teach my class, to try to help people who are coming up and going to go into the foreign policy apparatus, work at places like the State Department, at the Treasury Department, to really understand these tools. But then I realized, I only teach a couple dozen students a year. So maybe a better way to do that is to scale this up, write a book that's accessible, that is engaging, and that you can kind of read and enjoy, but by the end of it, you're like, okay, I kind of get it. I know what a sanction is. I can kind of understand when to use it, when not to use it. And I hope that's what I accomplished in Chokepoints, but that'll be up to everyone else to decide.
Do you think you've converted any of your students?
Well, I will. There may be some of my students in the audience. I'm not sure. I don't want to speak for them. But what I will say is I've been very pleased by how much interest there is right now amongst the next generation of foreign policy people, in the United States to work on these topics. And I think it's because when we were in college, Elizabeth, in the aughts, you never read about these things, right? I mean, it was every day. If you're reading about foreign policy, it was all about counterterrorism or the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. There was, you weren't really reading about economics, sanctions, tariffs. But now, every day the cover story of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post is involving these issues. And so I've been happy that my class is always oversubscribed, and I now have almost 10 students, I think, who are in these various agencies working on sanctions policy. But I will say I'm worried that some of them may be out of work if they wind up firing everyone who's a probationary employee, and I think that would be catastrophic. Because we need these types of people working in our government if we want these tools to be effective.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me reading the book was just how recent a lot of this history is. I mean, the big action of the book takes place in the last 30 years, 20 years, and it's really during your lifetime it's changed and unfolded, which also gives you access to a lot of the principal characters. What was it like, going to these people, doing interviews? What was your process reaching out to people? Were people excited to talk to you?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I've done, because this is, I think, actually like the key, and the key premise I had going into the book, and the reason I thought this might be a good idea. So I, as a student, back when we were in college together, Elizabeth actually studied ancient Roman history and was very interested in Hannibal. I was interested in ancient Greek history. So these were things where you couldn't interview the participants, unfortunately. And so, I'd sort of in school always learned that, there's no equivalent to documentary evidence, right? If you don't have access to the archives, you're not actually doing history, right? But then, you read Thucydides. Thucydides is contemporary history. He was an Athenian general, sort of a middling Athenian general reporting on a war that he was involved in. And he wrote a pretty effective history. And what it made me think is, maybe there is something to covering events of your lifetime because you actually can witness them. You can pick up on nuances that you don't understand in the documentary record. The other thing, too, and this comes back to my experience in government, I think that in this day and age, the paper process just doesn't hold as much weight maybe as it did 30 or 40 years ago. Diplomacy is done via WhatsApp and text message and signal chat. So if you're just relying on declassified NSC memos, you're probably not actually getting the real story. And so I thought talking to people would probably be, although imperfect, right? Because people misremember things and they have self-interested versions of history, would at least be the best way to do it. I think the biggest doubt I had, and I know Gail Ross, my agent, is here in the room somewhere. When I was pitching the book, I said, I'm going to have access to everybody. Everyone will talk to me because I'm part of this world. But the truth is, I'm not a journalist. I've never, reached out to somebody for an interview. And so this was the thing I was most nervous about because I signed this book deal and I promised, Penguin, that I was going to interview everyone. And no one had promised that they were going to interview with me. Thankfully, I think I was almost 100% at people interviewing with me. And I think for a few reasons. One is, thankfully, a lot of the people in the book are folks that I know and trust and trusted me that I wouldn't, maybe that they didn't think I would make them look good, but that I would at least be a fair interpreter of events. And then for the people I didn't know, and this I think was interesting, is at least I had one degree of separation away from them, right? So for instance, I don't know if Bob Lighthizer in the room, but he's a person I didn't know particularly well, but I know people who know Bob Lighthizer, and so he spent a lot of time talking to me for the book. And same with John Bolton, same with H.R. McMaster, people who served in the Trump administration, even though I didn't, I did not particularly serve for a very long time in the Trump administration.
What were for those of us who are writers or writing curious, what were your writing days like? What was your routine like?
Yes, this was another one that was a little, sort of a mystifying thing to me when I went into this process, because I started this project never having written a book before. And so I'd been teaching and working in the private sector. So what I wound up doing, the best piece of advice I got was from two friends. One, Stuart Reed, who wrote a fantastic book called The Lumumba Plot, which I'd recommend. And another, a friend, Chris Miller, who wrote Chip War, who was another one of our classmates, is basically just start writing as soon as you possibly can. And this would never have been my instinct because I like knowing everything before I actually write. But basically what I would do is I would spend, perhaps 3 or 4 weeks reading as many books as I could on the topic. So when I wrote the Iran section on the book, I probably read 5 to 10 books on Iran. I had two wonderful RAs from Columbia who were helping me collect data, collect news sources, and then I would probably spend anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a day just interviewing people. And thankfully today with AI, these interviews are automatically transcribed and searchable. So I wound up having over 200 hours of interviews that I could kind of search and find every single little anecdote that I wanted. And then usually after this 3 or 4 week process, I would then start writing a section.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of how the process unfolded.
Fascinating. Before we get into some of the specifics in the book, I think it might help to orient the group. Just tell us basically what you did when you were in the government doing sanctions. Like what were you working on?
Sure. Yeah. So I was fortunate in that I got to see this policy from several different angles. My first job in government, I was in the front office. I was a special assistant to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which is TFI, the big agent, division of the Treasury Department that does sanctions. And actually, my former boss, David Cohen, was here a few minutes ago, but had to run for a dinner party. But anyway, it was helpful for me to see what that looked like from the Treasury Department angle. Later, I had the good fortune of working at the State Department, where initially I worked on Iran sanctions, and it was sort of very lucky timing because I worked on this policy right when Rouhani was elected in 2013, and we got the original Iran nuclear deal in November of 2013. And the thing that was super useful about that was, it wasn't that I was like negotiating the deal or anything. I was too, junior. I was still a younger person at the time. But I was on the front lines of really implementing sanctions and understanding what it's like to go talk to a bank in Singapore and tell them that if they don't cut off Iran, we're going to sanction you, and declassify intelligence and go to meet with a maritime official in Hanoi and tell them that they're doing business with Iranian crude, and if they keep doing it, we might sanction them. And those types of diplomatic conversations, you learn a lot about what's actually happening where the rubber hits the road with sanctions policy. And then from there, really, bad fortune for the world, but was something that was a good opportunity for me was after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, I'd studied Russian history and European history, and I was really at heart always wanted to work on European issues. And so at the time, we didn't have anyone doing Russia and Europe sanctions because we didn't have sanctions on Russia. And so I sort of just put my hand up and said, I'll do this, and was lucky enough that someone in the room, Dan Freed, who was our sanctions coordinator at the time, was willing to take me along for the ride, basically, and go negotiate some sanctions with the Europeans and the G7 and figure out how to build alliance-based sanctions, which is something we didn't do, right? Before that, when you thought about building multilateral sanctions, it was always the UN Security Council, but we couldn't do that when we were sanctioning Russia. And then finally, the final experience I had was I never quite left that job just because it was very intense. But after about 18 months, I went to go work at the policy planning staff. And so for those, some people may be familiar with it, but those who aren't, it's a group at the State Department who works directly for the Secretary of State, advising sort of on the cross-cutting issues of policy. And so I covered all economic sanctions issues. So Russia, North Korea, Iran. And that was really helpful because that was sort of where I got the vantage point of understanding where the intersection was between the stuff that I was doing on the implementation side and diplomacy side with like what John Kerry was thinking and, Barack Obama.
So I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about the wider arc of sanctions history. Is there, as we discussed, much of the book takes place in the past 30 years, 40 years. Is there an early example of sanctions that really stands out to you as sort of a defining moment in the development of this economic tool?
Yeah, so I think that maybe I'll give a quick contrast because I think one question I'm often asked is, what makes this, the use of sanctions today new, right? Because sanctions have always existed. The U.S. had an embargo on France during, during Jefferson's presidency. There were sanctions in the Thucydidean era in ancient Greece, right? I think the best way to contrast it, Elizabeth, is if we go back to the 90s, because many of us in the room look like we remember the 90s. That was my sort of, I grew up in the 90s, so I love the 90s. We had an embargo on Iraq, right? This is a famous sanction, right, where the UN imposes an embargo on Iraq, including on Iraqi oil. And this was put in place right after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. And it stayed in place all the way until 2003 when we invaded Iraq, right? So for 13 years. Does anyone in the room know how that embargo was actually implemented and enforced? It was literally a 13-year, 24/7 naval blockade of Iraq. You had warships patrolling the Persian Gulf with American sailors and sailors from various other countries that were inspecting cargoes coming in and out of Iraqi ports. And so if you were ever suspicious and said, oh, maybe Iraqi oil is being sailed, they would get in a helicopter and fly onto the ship and take an oil sample and send it to a laboratory. So if you think about it, this is incredibly labor intensive, it's expensive, and basically it's just like another form of military force, right? The Pentagon is the one who's implementing it. And so as a result, there was a pretty high threshold to the use of sanctions, right? A big innovation happens in 2006, and that's when Stuart Levy, who's a key character in the book, kind of comes into the story. He's the first Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Treasury Department. And Stuart, I don't know if he's here, so excuse me, but he lives in Washington, but he had this really smart insight, which was we didn't actually need to do these types of burdensome UN sanctions with ships and things. We could just go directly to the CEOs of banks, give them declassified intelligence, showing them how their banks were being used basically to funnel money into Iran's nuclear program or to terrorist proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. And most of them would just decide that it wasn't worth doing that it was not in their interest to be doing this type of activity. And then, of course, you could also threaten secondary sanctions. And so what Levy did was he sort of pioneered this like direct-to-business diplomacy that was, by the way, paved the way for by Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary at the time, had been the CEO of Goldman Sachs. And so he would just like call up, the CEO of Deutsche Bank and said, hey, Stuart Levy's in town, come meet with me, meet with him. And they'd say, okay, roger that. And this worked. It worked. We figured out how to isolate Iran basically just by imposing pressure on banks. And so we got to the point where, and this is kind of the dividing line, which what I call the age of economic warfare, starting in 2006, where officials at the Treasury Department could sign a document in their office and impose sanctions much more dramatic even than that 1990s oil embargo that required all those ships.
There also, one of the parts that stuck out to me was also the role of convincing allies to sign on. The sanctions diplomacy worked in the private sector. And there was one point where you have China sort of is refusing to do something. And then they say like a couple weeks later, go look in this obscure energy journal and like just take a look. And then you have the administration taking a look and they find that basically China is sort of complying. Is that common, that kind of a game?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, I think, because there's this tool that some people may have heard of called secondary sanctions. What they are is it's not sanctions on an Iranian bank, for instance. It's sanctions on a bank in another country that's doing business with that Iranian bank. So the example you were talking about, Elizabeth, is this probably the most successful act of economic warfare in modern times, where in 2012, the US government, because of being forced by Congress basically, imposes sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran and tells foreign buyers of Iranian oil that they can only buy oil from Iran if they significantly reduce their purchases every 6 months. And this is backed by the threat of secondary sanctions. So for instance, if China continued buying more oil every 6 months from Iran, their banks would not be exempt from the sanction and as a result would be sanctioned by the US. Having done diplomacy, anyone in the room, done diplomacy with a Chinese official or an Indian official or really the official of any self-respecting country, they're not just going to say, okay, yes, sir, American master, like we're gonna listen to you. That's not how things work, right? Like, in fact, like they're more than likely to flip you the bird, if you're trying to pull off some mafia-style diplomacy. And so I think one of the virtues of the Obama administration's approach was that there was this cudgel, this threat of secondary sanctions, but it was really done in a diplomatic way, not trying to embarrass other countries. And as a result, you had countries like China comply with these sanctions, significantly reduce their purchases of Iranian oil. They never advertised it, and they never said, we're complying with American sanctions, but they did. And I think that's very, very important, and something I'm honestly worried about with the current administration, where they feel like they have to not only get what they want, but also embarrass and shame people in the process.
You mentioned the role of Congress, which I thought is fascinating here, because there was this push and pull between the administration and Congress, which kept wanting the administration to go tougher, tougher, tougher. Did that end up hurting the process or helping it, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think this is one of the more interesting findings from my own research, because when you're working in government, especially at a place like the State Department or the White House, like, you usually see Congress as a menace, right? You're like, why are they getting involved in my business? Like, stop. You guys don't do sanctions. You're just politicians. Like, we do national security. But sanctions are one of these strange things where not only can the president impose them, but Congress can impose them, right? That's the one big difference between military force, right? Congress is not dropping bombs on anyone, right? But they actually can sanction people. And during the Obama years, President Obama had very little, Congress had very little faith in President Obama's willingness to be tough on the Iranians. And there was a bipartisan supermajority in Congress for really draconian sanctions on Iran. And at the time, the Obama administration hated this. They said, Congress, go away. But Congress would pass these laws 100-0, right? So with veto-proof majorities over and over and over again. And it was annoying. But when you go back and look at it, it was actually critical, because what it did was, during the sanctions diplomacy we just talked about, it gave you a bad cop, right? If you're sitting there talking to a Chinese official and you said, look, I don't want to sanction your bank. I love you. You're great. But Congress is forcing me to do it. It is American law. Here, look at the statute. Yeah. And they'd say, oh. And that is really helpful. So in the end, I actually think, Bob Menendez, wherever he is right now, he was actually helpful in this process.
Is he here? No. So we've been talking about Iran, and I think you would agree that Iran was a successful case for the most part. But one of the also interesting things here that it proved a little bit hard to unravel. Like, there came a point where Iran was ready to come to the table, and the U.S. was limited in what it could give back. Is that a real problem?
It's a huge problem. I think one thing that's very important to understand about any tool of economic statecraft, this includes sanctions or export controls or tariffs, the U.S. government is not implementing them. It is the private sector who implements them, right? The U.S. government doesn't freeze assets. Citibank freezes assets, and if they don't freeze the assets, they could be fined by the U.S. government. And so what sort of a macro narrative of my book, Chokepoints, is kind of the effective conscription of the financial sector into America's economic wars. Basically, making bank CEOs realize that it wasn't optional whether or not to comply with sanctions, it was existential. And that's because you had things like BNP Paribas fined $9 billion in 2014, which wiped out their entire net income for the year. And so by the time we get the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, the banking sector is basically conditioned to reject any business with Iran. What we find after we actually get the Iran nuclear deal is we can't just tell banks then to go back into Iran, right? Like, John Kerry really wanted to do this, and this is one of my favorite scenes to write in the book, just because there's incredible irony in it. So I won't spoil the whole thing for you. But Stuart Levy winds up kind of becoming the antagonist to John Kerry, as he winds up going and working at HSBC. John Kerry wanted banks to go back into Iran for good reason. He wanted Zarif and Rouhani to be seen to be successful with the nuclear deal. He wanted it to be politically successful in Iran and to have durable support within Iran. But you can't just turn on economic activity. You can tell Citibank to leave Iran. You can't force them into Iran. You can tell ExxonMobil to leave Russia. You can't force ExxonMobil to reinvest in Russia. And in fact, I think if Trump does wind up lifting sanctions on Russia, I do not believe you're going to see big U.S. oil companies go back into Russia. And I think this is one of the weaknesses, frankly, of this tool of economic warfare, where it's much easier to destroy things than to build them back up. So in some ways, it's one of these tragic parallels with military force, where we're pretty good at bombing out cities and much less good at building effective societies.
You mentioned Russia, which is the next big example theme in your book. Russia obviously has been a big target of U.S. sanctions. But unlike Iran, it is unclear that it worked. What did the U.S. do wrong there?
Yeah. So there are a few key differences between the Russia sanctions and the Iran sanctions. I'll just name them first, and I'll answer your question. The first is that Russia is obviously a lot bigger than Iran. It's a bigger economy. And so I think when we imposed sanctions on Russia for the first time in 2014, they were the 8th largest economy in the world. They were larger than all other economies under sanctions combined. So take all the other 30 countries, and they're smaller collective GDP than Russia's GDP. And they're the world's largest producer of fossil fuels. And so I think it's sort of a Rubicon that's crossed when the 2014 Russia sanctions happen, because you are at a point where sanctions could have collateral damage on us, on the United States, right? Where you could potentially have worsen the Eurozone crisis and then have financial contagion that ruins the American recovery from the great financial crisis. So I think there's a little bit of empathy that's required, and that is a hard task. I think the other key difference is that the Obama administration was kind of working from behind events. Iran's nuclear program was a crisis, but it was a slow-moving crisis, right? It wasn't like, they're building a nuclear bomb next week, like, let's stop it, right? It was like they're gradually building up the capabilities for a nuclear program over years and years and years. Russia, it was the type of thing where we showed up at work on, a Monday in February, and we were watching CNN, and we saw little green men in Crimea. And so that's when everyone scrambles to the Situation Room and starts spitballing about what to do. And you don't have any things off the shelf. So what I'd say about the Russia sanctions is, I think the Obama administration, given the circumstances, did about as good of a job as it could have done in the first year after the Crimea annexation. I think where things started to go south was in February of 2015. So really the last 18 months of the Obama administration. Because what happened was, you go back to the winter of 2014, 2015, and this is almost forgotten by history. But the combination of the sanctions that were put in place on Russia and the collapse in oil prices fell by 50% in the second half of 2014, destroyed Russia's economy. And in the winter of 2014 to 2015, the economy was contracting at about an annualized rate of 10%. So falling off a cliff. And Putin actually publicly gave up his Novorossiya goal, which was shocking. I think that's the one time I've ever seen Putin publicly backtrack on something. And the reaction of European leaders wasn't, okay, let's go, let's push our advantage. It was, holy shit, this is going to hurt us. We don't want to there's literally a quote from Francois Hollande, is we don't want to bring Russia to its knees. And so what do? Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the Chancellor of Germany and President of France, fly to Minsk, which is not a fun place to be in February, and spend 16 hours straight with Putin and Poroshenko, who's a chocolate magnate and the president of Ukraine, and negotiate a ceasefire. And I think was not particularly well constructed. And the problem was that after that, we just allowed the sanctions to atrophy. Even when Russia violated the ceasefire, we never increased the pressure. In May, so just a few months after this deal was signed, the Minsk agreement, Germany signed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal. So what's the message that's being sent to Putin there? It's, the West doesn't have the stomach to impose real economic pressure on me. And then tragically, after Russia blatantly interferes in the 2016 US election, Obama does nothing. Slap on the wrist. For no good reason, honestly. And this is something I was in the administration, I couldn't explain it at the time, I can't explain it now. And perhaps needless to say, Trump becomes president and he immediately tries to lift sanctions on Russia. Congress thankfully stops him by passing a law in the summer of 2017 when Congress was still willing to, you still had some Republican hawks who were willing to actually, outvote their own president. But over the 4 years of Trump's administration, he does absolutely nothing on sanctions. So by the time Joe Biden gets to the fall of 2021 and the US intelligence community has the biggest success in modern intelligence history where they actually nail it and get Putin's plan and say he's going to invade Ukraine in 6 months, by then Putin's had 6 years in which he's recovered his economy, he's done what he could to sanctions-proof his economy, and critically, psychologically, he's learned a lesson, which is, I am not going to face lasting economic pain no matter what I do. And I think that's really tragic.
So, and even if the U.S. did, or the G7 did impose major economic pain later, it didn't stop him from actually doing anything.
I think this is the key point, Elizabeth, because what the Biden administration's goal was deterrence, right? They wanted to use the threat of devastating economic harm to deter Putin from invading, right? Because they had 6 months in which they had the war plans, right? They literally knew what Putin was going to do. They had 100,000 troops sitting on the Ukrainian border for almost 5 months, right? From September of 2021, when the Zapad exercise happened, to February of 2022. And this was a coordinated public messaging campaign saying, we're going to impose swift and severe consequences on your economy, the most aggressive sanctions that are ever imposed. And it didn't work. He invaded Ukraine. And the tragedy, too, is, and it doesn't take, I don't have to live in Putin's head to make this conclusion, Putin underestimated the damage his economy would face. And the best way we know that is 48 hours after the invasion started. In a really amazing show of Western solidarity, the West imposes sanctions on the central bank of Russia. This $630 billion central bank. And Putin had left half of the reserves sitting in Western bank accounts. So you got to ask yourself, if Putin thought that the West was going to sanction his central bank 48 hours after the war, why did he leave $300 billion sitting in European and American accounts? It's because he didn't think we were going to do it. And deterrence cannot work if your adversary underestimates what you're going to do. And so I think part of that failure is a communications failure and a planning failure on the Biden administration, because they actually did not plan to do sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia. But I don't want to put the blame totally at their feet, because this is a 6-year process dating back from the last year and a half of Obama's term, all 4 years of Trump's term, in which I think Putin learned the lesson that the West just didn't have the backbone.
I want to get back to that planning point when we talk about the future of sanctions, but just moving to the last country here, China. In general, this is where Trump kind of the Trump administration, and you're telling, really distinguished themselves by going after Chinese technology and hampering them from growing too much in that sector. But there's also a bigger shift here, which is, in this case, sanctions is the end in itself. It is not sort of the means to an end. You're not trying to get China to change its behavior, but you're actually just changing the Chinese economy. Do you think that shift in sanctions is it just sort of a parallel track, or is it that here to stay?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you're asking this, because this is one of these subtle changes that it's sort of imperceptible at the time, but then when you look back at it, it feels pretty significant. So I do think what Trump did during his first term against China was a very significant shift in American policy for a variety of reasons. In the first instance, I think starting, if you go back to 2016, the last year of the Obama administration, I think most people in the Obama administration felt that China was an adversary by then. They were already doing their militarization of the South China Sea. There was a lot of bad stuff going on. But still, I think even if you would ask people at the top of the Obama administration, they'd say China's too big to sanction. You're not going to actually impose real economic sanctions or export controls on China. And I think Trump successfully broke that taboo, right? The export controls on Huawei and the foreign direct product rule were really significant, right? I mean, there were penalties on the most important company in China that really did quite a bit of harm to that company and showed that you could make significant headway, significantly curb Huawei's 5G ambitions. They were at the time kind of rewiring the world with their telecommunications equipment, and I think it was pretty successful. But I think the almost more important thing, and this is the one that's subtle, is if you go back to the time when I was working in government during the Obama years, anytime you were, and this is true I think during the George W. Bush administration too, anytime you were to bring up any sanction or export control, you always thought of it as a means to an end, right? The goal here is to change behavior. The natural state of affairs is open trade and open finance, and the unnatural state of affairs is being sanctioned, right? And so sanctions were inherently temporary. They were supposed to be a temporary state of affairs. But if you look at the Trump administration's economic war against China and the export controls on Huawei, for instance, there's zero behavioralist calculus there. The whole goal is just to weaken Huawei and to basically stop Huawei from becoming the dominant player in global telecom. And by the way, Biden builds on this. I mean, Biden expands that to cover the entire Chinese economy and basically trying to curb access of the most advanced semiconductors from all of China. And Jake Sullivan says that the explicit goal of the policy is to maintain as large of a lead as possible, right? So it's less of a behavioralist calculus and much more just about weakening an adversary. And to me, the reason that's important is this is a paradigm shift, right? It signals that we've moved on from the win-win calculus of globalization to something different. And it's what I call the age of economic warfare, where economic relations, at least between adversaries, are seen more as zero-sum than win-win. And I think that's the direction of travel, basically, regardless of who you have in the White House.
Based on some of these shifts in sanctions, is it possible that sanctions could deter China from invading Taiwan?
I'm highly skeptical that sanctions could deter China from invading Taiwan. And in fact, what I'm more worried about in terms of deterrence with respect to China invading Taiwan is that China may assess that the U.S. would not intervene in war, if China were to blockade Taiwan or quarantine Taiwan, because that we would be too worried about the domestic economic harm it would do on the United States. And I think this is one of the big macro sort of almost like ironies of my book. And if you read Chokepoints, you'll realize that I like irony. I think it's just, they're delicious when you come upon them. Is that a big reason that the U.S. turns to economic warfare with such gusto in the early 21st century is because military force becomes politically toxic, right? Again, going back to the 90s, there's military interventions left and right, in all these different countries, right? In the Balkans, in Latin America, and parts of Africa. But then after Iraq and Afghanistan, there's just no political support for this stuff anymore, right? And no president, not even George W. Bush in his second term, is willing to even consider, the use of military force in a limited manner. In some way, Libya is a bit of an exception, but I think that also winds up, just making presidents even more gun shy about, using military force. And so sanctions and other tools of economic warfare become almost like the more politically palatable alternative. But I think one of the ironies is that as we started using these tools against bigger and bigger countries, first Russia and then especially China, it's almost more politically difficult to impose sanctions than it is to go to war, at least in a limited manner. Because if you're imposing sanctions on China, you sure as hell be ready for a recession at home and some serious inflation. And I think this is a big lesson also of the Biden administration's sanctions on Russia. I mean, Joe Biden, the single most hawkish American president on Russia in the post-Cold War era, was not willing to go after Russian oil. And it's because he was worried about inflation and gasoline prices. And so if you're at that point, you're getting to a point now where our adversaries realize that American presidents are very nervous about any sort of domestic economic harm.
Yeah. I want to get to questions after this next one, so prepare yours. Given those calculations, there are limits to how far the U.S. is willing to go. The international economies are sort of decoupling. So Iran has other possibilities, other economic possibilities, other than relying on U.S. financial institutions, things like that. And same with Russia. Do you think there is a place for a strong sanctions regime moving forward? And what would that look like?
Yeah, I think that we are condemned to continue to fight economic wars for the foreseeable future. Jack Lew, someone who I deeply respect, said in 2016 that America was overusing sanctions and we needed to use them less. And at the time, I disagreed with him, and I publicly stated that in a foreign affairs essay. And it wasn't because I think the U.S. should be using sanctions more. I think it's because we are living in an age of economic warfare in which sanctions, tariffs, export controls, they are the way that great powers compete with one another. There's something structural going on, which is that the world economy is still designed for the benign halcyon days of the 1990s, but we're living in an era of intense geopolitical competition. And so I think it's inevitable for there to be significant economic competition and, in fact, warfare between the U.S., China, and Russia. And I think, thankfully, at least up until now, we're still constrained from fighting hot wars with these countries because of the specter of nuclear annihilation. So I think there has to be a space for an effective sanctions and export control policy. I think what we're doing right now, though, is we're still sort of playing this in an unserious way, right? Where you have authorities that are dispersed across multiple agencies. You don't have a clear lead on these issues. So much time is just spent figuring out who is the right person to call on something. There's nothing like the Pentagon for economic warfare. And I think there probably should be. You look at other countries are doing this. The Japanese now have a cabinet minister for economic security. Wow. The EU has an economic security strategy. China has, over 1,000 people working on, a platform to trade in central bank digital currencies to evade the dollar, right? We don't have anything like that. And I think it's time for us to take it more seriously.
Fascinating. Question time. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Eddie. Really looking forward to reading the book. So you mentioned that these tools do have downsides, and it's easy to destroy things and harder to rebuild them. So in that context, is there a risk here that, to coin a phrase, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail? And how would you set, or how do you think, or how are limiting sort of principles or criteria to ensure that you are not, hitting, benign or minimally risky things, but not things that are, sufficiently risky, like some of the technology issues with China, or when countries invade other countries? How do you think about sort of putting principles or criteria to limit?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I do think there is a need for limiting principles, ideally negotiated multilaterally. If you could have some sort of norms for the use of sanctions and other economic weapons. Unfortunately, I think that's almost impossible right now, right? Given the current perspective of the Trump administration, and frankly, I think it'd be hard to get the Chinese and the Russians to agree to anything like this as well. So the question is, what can the US government do? My own view is that, and this is part of taking these tools seriously, and I consciously called my book American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, not the Age of Sanctions, because I think we use euphemisms about these things, right? We're like, oh, we're sanctioning them. No, we are literally trying to do harm to other countries' economies. And there are really serious collateral damages, and there are humanitarian harms. And I think if you use these sort of euphemistic language, you wind up in some ways overlooking the real harm that you could be doing. So I think the first thing is just being honest with ourselves about what we're doing. I think a big takeaway I have from these various sort of case studies and research I did in my book is, A, when you start an economic war, you better be ready to finish it. So if you're going to try to use sanctions to coerce Putin to leave Ukraine, you should be ready to go after his oil exports. There's no point in trying to fight Russia with a hand tied behind your back. At that point, you're probably better off not doing it in the first place. In terms of how to limit ourselves, I think we have over 30 sanctions programs right now. There's still sanctions against, the former Yugoslavia. There's sanctions against all different, Somalia, so many countries that I don't even know off the back of my, top of my head. In my view, we should get rid of 95% of them. And if the Department of Government Efficiency was actually doing what they should be doing, they'd be getting rid of these, old sanctions programs that no one's looked at since the 90s and focus very, very rigorously on China, Russia, and Iran, which are the key threats to U.S. national security. And I think then you'd have a much more disciplined approach.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I have a two-part question. Something which has been in the news since Trump tour almost on a daily basis. Could tariffs be construed as a form of economic warfare? And the second question I have is, and this is entirely speculative, that in terms of what's been going on between Trump and Russia and all this cozying up, that there's a spheres of influence theory that's going on. That, okay, we divide the world into three parts going back centuries. We control the Americas, although that seems very ambitious. Russia controls Europe, and China controls Asia. In that, if you look at that, which is entirely speculative, what would be the role of sanctions in that?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So quickly on tariffs. So historically, tariffs have been more of an economic tool than a national security tool, right? In the early part of American history, tariffs actually were used to raise revenue for the government, right? But mind you, this is when the government was like 5 people in an office, somewhere in Philadelphia or wherever it was, So it's not I think fit for purpose for revenue right now, despite what some people in the Trump inner circle have to say. More recently, and I think more plausibly and more justifiably, tariffs are used to protect domestic industries that are strategic. Why we think that we need to have certain things produced at home versus overseas. So for instance, the Biden administration put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And I think the reason was that Chinese EVs are very good and very cheap, and if there was open competition, they would completely flood the US market and probably put US automakers out of business. And maybe that's okay if you have cheap EVs, but do we really want to live in a world where all of our cars are made in China, and if China feels like it, they can weaponize that against the United States as a choke point? Probably not, right? What Trump is doing now is he's trying to use tariffs more like sanctions, basically to turn them into a national security tool. The problem there is that tariffs are a very weak tool in that respect. A tariff is a tax on imports, right? So if Trump actually goes ahead next week and imposed 25% tariffs on Canada, the maple syrup that I use for my daughter's pancakes every morning, we can still buy it. It's just going to be 25% more expensive. Okay, right? What would happen if we imposed sanctions on the Canadian maple syrup company, right? A, it'd be illegal for me to buy the maple syrup. And B, that Canadian company would probably go out of business the next day because they couldn't do business in dollars, right? So tariffs are not a fit-for-purpose tool in this respect. And I think when Putin hears that if he doesn't end the war in Ukraine, he's going to face draconian tariffs or whatever Trump says, he laughs at it because we have $2 billion worth of imports from Russia. So what are you going to do? Impose 25% tariffs on $2 billion? Like, for Putin, that's like less than a day's worth of oil revenue, you know? So I don't think tariffs are a fit-for-purpose tool, and I think Trump, honestly, is a little bit lost when it comes to this issue.
I did ask
spheres of influence. I'll answer that one quickly. So I do think, by the way, we're moving into a divided world economy. So again, I don't want to ruin the end of my book, but where we're headed, I believe, is a world where economic interdependence unravels. I think there are basically two ways that this could happen. The first is one where there are two blocks, right? You have a democratic bloc that's led by the United States, an authoritarian bloc that's led by China. Then there's probably a messy middle, right? I think this is the direction we were headed in during the Biden administration. You know, Janet Yellen called this friendshoring, you know, where you still have deep economic interdependence, but only with your allies, right? And you try to de-risk basically from authoritarian governments. I think the direction Trump is taking us in, because he's using these tools like sanctions and tariffs, not principally against adversaries, but actually against allies, right? Canada, Mexico, Colombia, the European Union, India, all of them have been threatened with tariffs so far. What that augurs is a much more chaotic breakdown of the world economy. And if you're a business and you don't know whether X country or Y country is going to be sanctioned or tariffed the next day, the only viable long-term investment is domestically. And so you wind up sort of going into autarky by default. And in that world, I'm pretty worried because what history shows is that if states can't secure markets and resources through open trade, they're tempted to seize them by force into imperialism and conquest. And I think when you hear Trump talking about seizing Greenland for their mineral resources, you got to be worried that there's something there, right? It's not just a man spitballing. Like, this is a logical conclusion if you feel like you can't securely get resources unless you physically plant the American flag on a territory.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your time. I have a real quick comment and a quick question. The comment is, why doesn't the Pentagon have an economic warfare policy shop? Well, I would say that, the military has DIME and PMISI as particular frameworks when they think about national security. And I think like the supply side economists and the free marketers that are still on the right would be very hesitant to let economic warfare and to operationalize the market or weaponize the market in a particular way. So I think that ideology is still very much entrenched in our sort of ethos. So that's my comment to why we might not have an economic warfare shop. And the second question, the question I have is, as sanctions become more offensive, what is the role of the IC? Yeah. So what was the role of the IC before? Under old paradigms, and now if we're shifting now and we're decoupling from EU and EU is going to be semi-assertive with their sanctions, what information is the IC fit for purpose now? How can the IC help with this new paradigm shift and this new sort of economic warfare? Thanks.
Yeah, good questions. Really quick, just so I'm not misunderstood, I do not believe that the Pentagon should play any role in sanctions policy, and God forbid they do. I was lucky enough to serve a tour of duty working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, and they are professionals over there, but I would not want them doing our sanctions policy. I think what we need is either ideally a government agency, but at the very least, some sort of interagency body that is permanently doing economic warfare in a strategic way that's similar to what the military does. Your second question was about
IC.
The IC is critical, right? I mean, the way that like people ask, well, how does the U.S. government know, like, if Iranian oil is being smuggled through Malaysia and being you need intelligence for that. You need all different types of intelligence. You need human intelligence. You need signals intelligence. You need satellite imagery. It's very important for the intelligence community to be integrally involved. I think back when I was working on these issues, we had a very close partnership with the IC, and oftentimes we were like haggling, trying to force them to declassify things so we could, show them to foreign governments and give them the chance to fix their behavior before we sanction them. I hope it's still the case, because you can't do effective economic warfare without intelligence.
Thank you.
I have a question. During your work on the sanction design, have you ever encountered a situation where you have conflicting goals or where your instruments pull you in different directions? I have a motivating example in mind, so maybe to clarify my question. In the early 2022, when sanctions on Russia was imposed, one of clear goals was to design a currency crisis. So you see, turn the ruble into ruble, as was said by Mr. Biden. So what you saw is the ruble losing its value, is depreciating. But after that, what would you expect to continue is to allow capital outflow from Russia, so ruble continue to fall and currency crisis to unwind. Yet exact opposite has happened. So you see capital closed inside the Russian borders. So in May, Central Bank of Russia even decreased its capital outflow controls. It doesn't say that we don't need really capital outflow controls because capital isn't being welcomed outside. So ruble get back. And now it is broadly at the same level it was pre-war, I say. So is it the case of conflicting goals, conflicting instruments, or trying to do a lot with maybe conflicting bodies? What is it?
Yeah. Look, I think it's very difficult for the US government to precisely target the impact of sanctions. And I think that's just something that we have to be honest about. Whenever you hear an official talk about precision targeted sanctions or anything, it's just not how they work, right? Because we're not even implementing these things, right? You're putting out regulations that then the private sector is interpreting, and different companies have different risk calculuses, right? I think with respect to Russia, I've heard this argument before. Basically what he's saying is, wouldn't it be better if we had fewer financial sanctions on Russia so you would allow capital to flow out of Russia? I think theoretically you might be right. However, I would recall that very early in the war, the Russian government put really draconian capital controls in place for this exact reason, right? They didn't want billionaires to take their money out of the country. And the reason that the ruble recovered a lot of its value wasn't because the ruble, the economic fundamentals of the Russian economy were strong. It's because money couldn't get out of the country, right? So you had an artificially inflated currency. So my own view is, at least in the specific context you're talking about, I have a bit of a different perspective, which is I think that even, the sanctions have done quite a bit of damage to Russia's financial sector, and I don't think there's much we could have done to incentivize more capital flight because the Russian government would have stopped it for their own reasons.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk. If we look at sanctions, the role they play, a lot of it is our fear of nuclear war. In other words, that's what we're doing instead of a nuclear war, which is going to blow out Putin and Trump and all of us. So who do the sanctions actually affect? They don't really critically affect the hierarchy in any of these cultures. Most of it is people lower on the hierarchy. So my point is, we're operating in a world now that's like the mafia. There are different mafias in different parts of the country. Trump has decided that our best bet is to work with the different mafia elements in the world as opposed to confronting them too much. So we don't get out of this because of this mafia situation. I mean, if we put sanctions on Russia, Putin isn't going to be voted out of office.
Yeah.
None of these people are going to really lose.
Mm-hmm.
He'll be able to get his caviar and all that. So we have to start looking at the actual international structure of who controls the world and who's working with whom and where the real people who are suffering. The people who are going to suffer are the Palestinians, and the lower elements in the world culture. And it was almost a real mistake to have Russia have have Israel threatened because it just gave us, the United States and its weapons, and Israel, the opportunity to blow out the Palestinians. I mean, they didn't stop. They weren't going to stop for Hamas.
Yeah, so maybe just to touch on the first thing you said, which is, sanctions don't affect leaders of foreign countries. That's true, right? And I think this goes back to my point about euphemisms, right? Where we say, oh, well, the sanctions are targeted at the elites. The U.S. can't bankrupt Putin himself, right? I mean, he controls an economy like a king, right? We can't bankrupt Ayatollah Khamenei. If you're using sanctions as a tool of behavior change and you're being honest with yourself about what the actual theory of the case is for how they're working, they're imposing macroeconomic harm. They're doing things like depreciating foreign currencies, which leads to imports being more expensive, causing inflation, causing economic recessions, making people's lives worse, making people unhappy, and ideally channeling that into pressure from below on a government to change their policy. And I think if you look at the Iran nuclear deal, there's an incredible historical contingency, a luck, that in 2013, when Iran is in the throes of the worst part of a recession, they have a presidential election in which you have 8 candidates, a guy who was not even on the radar of anyone's sort of radar screen, Hassan Rouhani, 2 weeks before the election, in a publicized debate, sort of goes off script and says, we need to negotiate away our nuclear program to get sanctions lifted. And it's one of those things where in authoritarian societies, you never hear the truth. And once he says this, there's like a groundswell of support. And the guy winds up winning 52% of the vote in an 8-person field, which is pretty hard. And so I think that what you're saying is true. And my only sort of recommendation, it's not so much that you don't use sanctions, because there are, I think Russia invading its neighbor and, trying to wipe out an entire nation is, you got to respond, right? But I think you need to be honest with yourself about the collateral damage and only use these tools when there is a serious national security threat at stake and you have a clear goal for what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, sanctions are like soft bombs, so to speak.
Hi, thanks for your time. This is related to the commentary around Huawei. This morning, I think a Norwegian natural gas company announced that they are not going to allow American shipping to refuel. What would preclude the Donald Trump from sanctioning that company? Secondly, if that company was an American subsidiary of, say, ExxonMobil, what would preclude it from doing that? And generally speaking, do any constrictions exist on the broad executive prerogative regarding sanction policy? And did that play a role in the John Kerry disputes on Iran? And broadly, do you believe there should be any constraints on executive prerogatives to use sanctions?
Yeah, so I'll touch on your last point because I think it's the most important. So the president basically has limitless authority to impose sanctions. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is a 1977 law, means that the president can declare a national emergency and impose sanctions on anyone. And that's the reason why Trump thinks that he can just impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And in fact, he's used this law to justify his tariffs. It's legally debatable whether that law can be used for tariffs, but it's crystal clear that it could be used for sanctions, right? So if tomorrow Trump said, actually, I've decided I don't want to impose 25% tariffs on Canada, I want to impose a trade embargo on Canada, we're not buying anything from them, he almost certainly can do that legally. There's a real question whether the president should have that kind of a power. My own view is that he probably shouldn't. And there should be some more significant legal and legislative constraints on the use of sanctions, especially now when they're actively reshaping commerce. Do I think that that's going to happen anytime soon? No.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eddie. This is a remarkable book. Thank you. And thanks to all the great questions.
Thank you, everyone.